So in today's screencast, we're going to look at variables. So when we're talking about a variable, we're talking about an area of storage, and that allows you to store a piece of information. A variable has a name and a value, and that will be called a name-value pair. So when you're giving it a name, you should always name your variable something that means something. So if it's going to store, counter information, you should call it count. If it's going to store a name, so if it's a string that stores a name, you should call it name. If it, whatever it is, you should always give it a name that means something. So when we're talking about the values, variables can have various different values. So you can have numeric values. You can have string values. So as I said, if we're talking about a name, then that would be a string. If we're talking about somebody's age, that would obviously be numeric value. But you can also have different kinds of variables. So you could have what's called a Boolean variable, and that just has a true or false value. And we'll look at all of these types of variables as we go through the content for the next couple of weeks. We will mainly be looking at both numeric and string values, or string variables when we're dealing with variables over the course of this course, but we will come across some other ones as we go as well. So as I've said, we can use variables to store information, and it just, I suppose, allows you to do various different things in programming that it might be more difficult if you couldn't store variables. So we're going to have a look at how do we go about creating this variable and then giving it value. So when you create it, you give it a name, and then you refer to that name over and over again if you want to give it an initial value, and that's what's called initialization in programming. Or you can change the value of the variable, and then that allows you to use the variable in various different ways as you go. So we're going to have a look at a project, and this is a counter project. Now we've seen this. If you were at the workshop on Saturday, you will have seen this counter project. So I'm just going to go through it quickly with you again, just to remind you of what we did. And then I'm also going to look at how can we change it. So in the basic example, we're going to create a new project. So then we'll create a counter variable. And when the A button is pressed, we'll add 1 to that counter. When the B button is pressed, we subtract 1 from the counter. And then when the A and B buttons are pressed together, we'll display the value of the counter variable. But then once we have that done, then we're going to look at changing it. So for example, when the A button is pressed, we might add 3 to the counter. And when the B button is pressed, we'll subtract 2 from it. So let's just do the basic one first, and then we'll move on. So in makecode.com, we're going to create a new project. Now in this case, we're going to use the onStart, because we're going to, when we create our variable, we're going to initialize it. And that, all your initialization, so that's where you give things initial values, that all should happen in the onStart. So I'm just going to pick up the forever block and delete it. So in the onStart, if we right click here, you can get help on any of the blocks. And in the onStart, it's going to tell us a little bit about, the help will tell us a little bit if it ever comes up. So an event that runs when the program starts. So when the simulator, or when the microbit starts, whatever is in the onStart block, it will be done, and it will only be done then. So you need to be careful about what you put into the onStart block, because if you're expecting something to be done later, after the microbit starts, then it won't be done if it's in the onStart block. So here we're just going to go, sorry, that's just giving you a little bit more information there, so you can have a look at that yourself. So we're going to go to variables here, and we're going to make a variable. We're going to call it counter, and I'm going to click OK. Once I do that, you'll see you get a couple of blocks that weren't there. So you get this counter that you can maybe show the value of the counter by just dropping that into a show number. We can set the value of the counter to something, and we could change the value of counter by something. So I'm just going to get rid of that there for a second. So I'm just going to go back to variables there again, and I'm just going to set counter to 0 on start. So that's the very start, so we're doing our initialization. Then I'm going to go to input, and I'm going to go on button A pressed. And then I'm going to go back to variables, and I'm going to change the value of counter by 1. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click the A button. Now we'll see that it's not showing anything here. Even though I'm doing something, it's not showing anything. But that's because I haven't actually asked it to show. I've just said change the value of counter. So remember we said that when the A and B button are both pressed together, then we're going to show the value. So I'm just going to bring across on button A pressed, click, change it to A plus B, and then I'm going to go to basic and show number, and I'm going to go back to variables, and I'm going to pull across counter. So this is going to show the value of the counter. So now it's restarted. I'm going to click the A and B button, and that's going to show it as 0. I'm going to click the A button once, twice, and then I'm going to click the A and B button again, and that's going to show the value of counter is 2. If I click the A button again, 1, 2, 3, 4, it should show my value as 6, which it does, and 1, 2, 3, it should show it as 9, which it does. So my A is working, my A and B is working, and now all I have to do is get my A plus B button. So I'm just going to duplicate that, duplicate the A button, change the A to B, and I'm just going to change the value of counter by -1. So now it's restarted again. So I'm going to click the A button, 1, 2, 3, show the value, it should be 3, click the B button, it should be 2, click the B button again, it should be 1, click the A button, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it should be 6, and then we'll click the B button, 1, 2, 3, and it should be 3. So that's just a very basic project, just showing you how to use a variable. So remember, you have to create the variable. In creating it, you give it a name. You can give it a value. So we're doing that a couple of different times here. So we're setting the counter to 0, which is giving it its initial value. But then when the A button is pressed, we're changing the counter by 1. So whatever the value of the counter is, it will add 1 onto it. When the B button is pressed, we're changing it by -1. So whatever the value is, it's going to take 1 off it. And then finally, we're just showing the value of the variable here. So what I'm going to do now that we've done that, well, first of all, I'm going to save it. And I'm just going to call it a counter. And that will download it to my downloads folder. And again, remember, I can copy it onto my microbit once I have it in my downloads folder. But what I'm going to do now is, instead of changing the value of counter by 1 here on the A button, I'm going to change it by 3. And instead of changing it by -1 when the B button is pressed, I'm going to change it by -2. So now it's restarted again. My value should be 0. If I press the A button 1, 2, 3 times, it should have the value of 9, which it does. If I press it 1, 2 times again, it should have 15. So there's your 1 and your 5, so that's your 15. And then if I press the B button once, it should go back down to 13, which it does. I'm going to press it 1, 2, 3 times, and it should go back down to 7. And then if I press it once again, the A button, it should go back up to 10. So you don't just have to change the value by 1 or change it by -1. You can change it by whatever you want. So that's just a very basic project showing you how to use a variable. I hope you find it useful.